Welcome to the Enneagram 2.0 podcast. I'm Beatrice Chestnut.
I am Uranio Paes.
And today we are talking about the pathway to the improbable partnership that Uranio and I have entered into to teach the Enneagram. What do you think about this topic?
I think it's accurate. It was improbable and it's wonderful. And it's nice to share a little bit about our journeys regarding this.
Yes, I think because we're so dedicated to the Enneagram and doing deep work with it, I think it's important to help people understand what exactly that means, because the Enneagram has exploded in popularity these days, and there's a lot of different ways that people work with it. And of course, I think that one of the ideas we share is that sometimes it's worked with in more superficial ways, and we are really dedicated to doing deep work with it. And there's a way that the way we've worked with it has evolved, and the things we do with it today when we help people apply it, especially in a really profound way for inner transformation. I think it's interesting both how that happens and also how we came to making that happen. So the idea today is for each of us to talk a little bit about our own path to coming to the Enneagram work, to doing our own Enneagram work, applying it as a tool in our own development, but also how we came together and how each of us brings different things to this partnership, and how what we do and how we work together can really shed light on the Enneagram itself and the possibilities connected to working with it.
Exactly.
What do you think of that?
Yeah, exactly. I think it's useful for us to share a little bit of how we work and why, and just to elaborate a bit on that for further understanding. And behind this, there is our belief around how to do Enneagram work in a way that fully respects the depth of this system. But I also think that at times it will be necessary for you to talk about how I work and for me to talk about how you work.
Yes, exactly. And even interview each other a little bit about how we do what we do, because I think it's been mysterious at different points, but I think you're right that we can also hold a mirror up to each other's work as a way of giving a really full picture of what we do and how we came to do it.
It's definitely unconventional, and I doubt that one podcast will explain it all. But it's good that we start and we try it.
Yes, and I have to say I've been inspired a bit by listening to some of the podcasts out there in the world right now, where different people who have become voices of self-development work, psychological and spiritual development work, and how they talk about their own journeys and their own insights and how they went through certain experiences that have helped them have the view they have today of the importance of this kind of self-development path and the meaning of it, not only for us as individuals, but for people generally right now. Like how do we understand the path of self-development, especially since I think so many people now are really opening up to the possibilities in ways they maybe didn't conceive of before.
And it's interesting to talk about this, B, because you and I even don't completely know what will unfold from our work. And I doubt that any significant Enneagram teacher in the world has ever known how their work with the Enneagram would unfold. Because when it comes to a system like the Enneagram, it really feels like the system uses us and we don't use it. And it unfolds in terms of understanding in ways that are not very logical. And many times we get downloads, not only about Enneagram theory, but also about what to do and how to help people the most.
Exactly. I like that you're pointing to that element of mystery, because I do think this is an unfolding experience, and it's guided by a higher wisdom that I think I wouldn't have necessarily understood or even believed in, 20 years ago. And it's both exciting and inspiring the way things do unfold in ways that none of us could predict for ourselves before they happen.
So, how do you think we should start talking about the way we met and met again?
Yeah. So, well, let's maybe start a little bit more in depth about our backgrounds than maybe we've talked about before, especially with regard to um, some of the experiences we had earlier on that really inform what we do today. For instance, I know that you were, for a long time, a business consultant, a coach. You used the Enneagram a lot in the work that you did. But you also have done some really significant spiritual development work. So I'd like to hear you say a little bit more about both of these, especially from the point of view of what these different experiences and both in both categories. I think there's a lot of depth of your experience over time that I'd like to hear a little more about that maybe you've said before on the podcast. So maybe you could talk first a little bit about just what you think you got from your business experience, consulting and coaching, that informs what you do today and the work that we do together.
Right. Yeah. My academic and professional background is mostly in business. I graduated and then did a master's in Brazil. Master is something that is really central in Brazil. Most people go do it before doing a PhD, and then even instead of doing an MBA. So that was an academic path, but really solid that I had. And I started working as an organizational consultant. I mean, an assistant organizational consultant when I was still at university, and never stopped. And I therefore ended up having 25 years of experience working with it as my main job. And only in more recent years, I stopped doing that, at least as the main thing I did, to open up more space to this other area of doing public workshops that are more in depth, and then finally doing them with you. Now, my experience with people at work of all types was immense, because we ended up taking the Enneagram to over 15,000 people. What that contributed was with a very big knowledge of each person, each type, its subtype, each instinctual sequence, but also the path of growth. And that really helped me on the other side, the more in-depth trainings that I did later.
And so, how long did you work in business as an organizational consultant before you learned the Enneagram, and how did you bring it in when you learned it?
Yeah, when I learned the Enneagram, I had been working as an organizational consultant for about 7-8 years. And I worked for an extra 5 years after learning the Enneagram. I worked in business without the Enneagram because I wanted to study it seriously before I started using it professionally. So I was an organizational consultant before using the Enneagram.
And then you applied the Enneagram in individual coaching as well as team and organizational work. Is that right?
It is. I actually ended a business I had with training, consulting, and coaching for healthcare companies in Brazil and Latin America, and then started a company specializing on using the Enneagram in businesses, as in training, consulting, and coaching also, but specializing on the Enneagram.
And it sounds like, as you said, what that really helped you do was have a lot of a deep sense of how to apply knowledge of the types to help someone grow and develop, like what the growth path is of each of the types and how to support someone in moving along that path.
Yes, and as a consultant, I have always been bold. Like, I wouldn't do only conservative approaches. I would try to bring in tools and approaches that would help group teams achieve deeper transformation. It's my style. But then the Enneagram really helped me do even more of that. And I ended up being known as a consultant that could work with harder cases, like people with having a lot of conflict, or people who were really open-minded to go deeper, or companies that were engaged in true change management processes. So the Enneagram helped a lot when I did that.
During part of this time, you also started doing different kinds of spiritual work. Can you tell us a little bit about that? Because I think the different kinds of work you've done has been both deep and very fascinating. So can you tell us a little bit about that and maybe how you got into that?
Right. I think I was very lucky to know the Enneagram exactly together with meditation and different sorts of therapies. So when I learned the Enneagram, I started doing all sorts of therapy and all sorts of meditation. And it was a very intense moment in my life that I did it a lot. And I stayed in that line of development or school for about 8 years, doing different practices. It was never one only, but a lot, doing it a lot. Then after that, I joined a fourth way school, which is a Gurdjieffian school, that did a lot of in-depth work, but also included Gurdjieff's approach to the Enneagram. Gurdjieff was a big pioneer on the Enneagram field. A little less about the typological Enneagram, a bit more about the symbol and the centers of intelligence and human evolution as a whole. And I stayed there for another 8 years. And I learned a little bit about some approaches to the process Enneagram in there, but mainly I worked on myself with a group every week. And then later on, I went to Sufism and stayed for 6 years, maybe 7, learning some methods of inner work, and also a little bit about their vision on the Enneagram.
And I think both of these are really amazing and profound paths of spiritual development. So this is maybe where I say something that I think I've seen in you that is really amazing, that, again, maybe it wouldn't be humble for you to say about yourself. But first of all, I think if people don't know who Gurdjieff is, as you said, he was a mystic. He taught a method of psycho-spiritual development, but with a lot of deep roots in really amazing, I don't know what we might call it, mystical wisdom tradition. He was mysterious about it in some ways, but also said it came from esoteric Christianity, but was a kind of a trickster, and but was a really profound thinker and figure in a way that was, I think, different than a lot of people of the last century out there. And he gave us really a lot of information about the symbolism behind the Enneagram. And we won't go into too much of that today, but just to know that being in a fourth way school, and again, what Gurdjieff taught, his kind of approach was often called the fourth way, because the first 3 ways are sort of, they sort of parallel the centers of intelligence. Like the first way might be the way of the body, or finding enlightenment through body practices. The second way would be the way of the heart, finding the sort of being a monk in a school of the heart, developing devotion, the devotional practices. And the third way might be the monk of the mind, developing or moving toward enlightenment or self-development through really focusing on developing the mind. And what Gurdjieff said is there are these three ways, and there are examples of people who have developed in each of these three ways, but his method was the fourth way, which was in some ways staying in the world, not needing to go out into a monastery or a school away from life, but being in everyday life in the world and working on all three centers and working on bringing the work of these three centers together. So I think the fourth way idea is very central to Gurdjieff's teaching. And so I wanted to highlight that in terms of the fact that that's what it was, and that you studied in a school devoted to understanding his teachings, and in many ways applying them practically, which I think is very deep spiritual work of a kind that's both unique in some ways in the world, but also directly supportive of understanding how the Enneagram can be deployed as a very deep practice when one is on a revolutionary self-development path.
Yeah. And it's, in my view, a very modern path for today, because it really allows you to stay where you are, like the place you live, and having relationships and your job. You don't need to go to a cave to meditate or whatever, but you do very intense work. It's a true school of wisdom, not only a school that teaches you techniques.
Exactly. And I know some of the practices you did there were very challenging, and exactly the kind of challenging practices that a person needs to do in order to develop one's faculties, in order to develop a certain kind of um, ability to be more self-aware, to be more conscious in exactly the ways the Enneagram points to. Anything you would want to share about, any particular work that you did, either in the Gurdjieffian Fourth Way School or in the Sufi work you did, that can give us people an example of the kind of work or skill that you developed there?
Yeah, one that comes to my mind right now was in the Gurdjieffian school, and it had to do with developing presence in all over the body and connecting to Earth, but then projecting the presence outside and learning how to experience whatever object was in front of you, and learning how to differentiate different kinds of objects. And by object is I mean anything. So we would get in touch with what Gurdjieff called the mineral soul in stones and different objects, and feel the difference and have an experience of becoming that, because it's what they call morphology of presence, like transforming the presence inside your body into something that goes outside and shapeshifts into that thing. And then discerning between states, different states, but then starting doing it with the vegetables, so like plants, and then animals. So a very conservative method until you get to merge with human beings, and to explore subtleties and be able to work with energy. And behind that, there was a whole preparation to know how to manage your field of energy, your the realm that protects us, so that we have spiritual experiences that get better organized, that don't go chaotic, and that are enough protected, and also that can be better retained by us in a way that we can come back to them later on. It's a bit hard to explain, but I think one thing we need to talk here today is about energy work. So it's perhaps a good introduction.
Yes, it's almost it sounds like it's almost a way of learning to be very conscious of energy. After all, we are all energy, right? The universe is made of energy. Everything we see is made of energy. But obviously, we walk through our daily life these days, and many of us don't really see the energetic level that everything is made of. We more see the solid, the table, the chair, the traffic. But it sounds like this education you had in this kind of energetic attunement or consciousness was a lot about almost starting at the meditative level, but then going into these practices where you practiced getting very conscious of where your energy was and developed an ability to direct your energy through a kind of conscious focus and breathing and different techniques. But it sounds like it's very much of a development of a heightened consciousness of energy. Would you say that's the sort of a getting close to how to understand it?
Yeah, I think you explained it really well. There are so many interesting aspects behind this. It's like appreciating someone who's talking to you in front of you, not only by listening, but by empathizing with the person, by being fully with that person. And what is to be with that person? It's to be that person at that time, but then be able to come back to being you. Just as one application of this energy thing. But then you can also go project your energy onto someone else and feel what's going on with a person from a perspective of what needs to be healed, or what pain the person is carrying, or what is really happening that the person is not coping with, which is what we do a lot in our trainings. But there are other things, like when it comes to objects and not people. I remember projecting my presence into some animals and getting much quieter in my head because those animals simply don't think. And that was wonderful for me as a mental type. It's really crazy to talk about this, even for my standards, at least before. But I experienced that in a very direct way that makes it undoubtable for me. And everybody else in that school did too. And another thing that is absolutely amazing is getting in touch with some qualities of that object's soul that allow you to sense into not what the object is now, but the whole history behind it. So imagine that you see a piece of wood and you connect with that piece of wood in energy. You sort of feel the whole story of the tree. It's what evidently actually happens if you get in touch with the essence of that person, or not person, object. But if you get in touch with the essence of a person, you don't see her for who she is now. You see her for all her journey, right? And this is the key of why some enlightened people, when they see their, let's say, disciples, they don't judge them and they see the very best in them. Some people say that this is the chief feature of a true spiritual master, to be able to see the very best behind everybody. And if you're in a doubt if the person is enlightened or not, that's one way to question.
So I want to help clarify even more what you're saying, because I think it's very profound, but also a bit hard to understand, because I think not very many of us have the opportunity to develop this specific kind of ability. However, I do think that more and more people are, especially people who are meditators or people who do certain kind of spiritual practices, can maybe know what this means. But I really want to differentiate what you're talking about, this kind of developing an ability to consciously resonate with something outside yourself. First, like you said, you started with rocks, then you went to plants, and then you went to a fish. That this is sort of a gradual development of the ability to project your presence and really almost understand from the inside something outside yourself. But I really want to differentiate this from something that some of the Enneagram types do unconsciously, which is merge. We're not talking about that, right? This is some types, twos merge emotionally, nines merge energetically at this level of being. But in this case, in the level of personality, that's very different than what we're talking about when we're talking about sort of understanding the energy of something else, because this merger in personality is very much of an unconscious mechanism, almost of defense or of survival. And so this is not that, but I would say it's sort of the higher level conscious aspect of something similar to that. Would you say that's true?
Yeah, I appreciate what you've just said. And also, we had to learn how to merge and how to unmerge, how to get out of the merging state. And when it comes to a nine or a four or a two merging, they don't know how to unmerge. So that's a dilemma for them. And not only that, we learn how to get rid of all that energy that we had absorbed after we had merged. So it's going in and out of that merging. We what we called it was energy management, which to me is more appropriate because people think that energy work is just cool, but it's also dangerous if you do it in the wrong way.
Exactly. People who I think are really effective at teaching energy management and energy consciousness always talk about protection, boundaries, um, knowing how to protect yourself, knowing how to manage your energy in healthy ways. And I think it's about a higher consciousness of your own energetic field, which again can be mysterious for some people who don't have experience with this kind of thing. But I think it's becoming more and more uh, known in the world that this is something that can be very helpful and supportive of spiritual development, especially. So I think it's great that we're talking about this, especially because it's become such a big part of the work we do when we have Enneagram-based retreats that are spiritual in nature. And another thing I want to say about this is, I know that you and I both learned the Enneagram at first through the Narrative Tradition School, the Helen Palmer David Daniels School, and one of the things that I think is a core teaching that Helen Palmer especially always taught is a kind of becoming more aware of your awareness. And being able to shift your awareness in very simple ways. And I always appreciated that this was kind of a core principle that she spoke of that was very experiential, the way she would have people notice where their attention was and like put your attention on the far wall. Okay, now put your attention inside yourself. And I think at a very basic level, the Enneagram work is about self-observation. The Enneagram types are sort of guides for self-observation, what to look for, what to notice in yourself. But these shifts of attention are also very important because they allow you to start having conscious ability to manage where your attention goes. And what you're talking about sounds like a big upgrade of that, but also connected to it. Would you say that's true?
Yes, and I'm so grateful for having found the Narrative Tradition School with Helen's teachings on intuition and meditation and her deep understanding about the essence dimension for each type. And then I taught the EPTP, their program, for many years in different places.
And and the EPTP is the Enneagram Professional Training Program that they established. They're in some ways their teacher training program, but also for professionals and people who just really wanted to learn the Enneagram at a very deep level. And it's a beautiful program. And you taught it for many years in the Spanish and Portuguese speaking countries, right?
Yes, and David Daniels and Peter O'Hanrahan, they stimulated me to do a few approaches of my own while teaching the main curriculum. And what happened over time is that because the experiences were really deep, I started having very particular openings during the work that I was doing with the students that were always in sync with the parallel work I was doing in one of those schools that I mentioned. And after doing after having that opening, I would do therapy to integrate that and make sure that I wouldn't be caught by some psychological shadow and so on, because the openings were very big. And so mostly the openings were more based on instinct, in sensing energy and sensing stuff on people and practicing resonance. So it's like feeling in my body in a very vivid way what was going on in the person's body, sometimes before the person was aware of that. So being able to mirror that back to the person in a way that then she would be in touch with what she needed to be in touch with. And also report back some intuition that I was having from there, and then going after a particular story that arose from that intuition. So I think it was an effort of myself doing my work, then working with students and learning all those pieces in those beautiful schools of wisdom, and then doing therapy to integrate it all and talking to other colleagues like you about all that.
So I want to highlight that I think the special abilities that you have now that you bring to the work we do together, this is a bit complex. So I want to highlight how I see it, because I think on the one hand, from the outside, I might be able to explain it even better what I see you doing. So I think that the abilities you have now are a combination of really deep spiritual practice over time. In other words, people maybe can see this in the realm of meditation. Like if someone has a meditative practice that they develop over time, that they do all the time within a disciplined way over a long period, and have a good teacher, and what that person will develop is specific skills in, for instance, being able to concentrate your attention, be able to quiet the mind. These are specific, what I would call spiritual skills developed through disciplined spiritual practice. I think one element of what the amazing talent that you have now in healing and applying the Enneagram in deep ways comes from this experience you had over time of disciplined spiritual practices, not only meditation in your case, but other kinds of energy work that you're talking about, focusing your consciousness, these different things that we're talking about. I think that's one element of it is that you have really put in the time and the work to develop these skills based on particular practices. Now, another thing I think it's just important for people to know is that all of us, when we do psychological and spiritual work, we get in touch with our own gifts and capacities, like having a gift of, empathy, for instance, or having being a good therapist has different qualities to it, being a good spiritual practitioner. I think there is also a gift that you have, Uranio, that you have that has also been a product to some degree over the work you've done, through the work you've done as in the spiritual schools, that you've gotten in touch with intuition and unique gifts that you have as a person that have opened up. Like you've said, you've had openings. And so I just want to highlight that I think there are some hard-won skills you've developed through practice and also some gifts that you've gotten in touch with, intuitive gifts for understanding, for being able to open up space spiritually for people and things like that, that I think combine in the things that you can do when you're supporting other people in their healing and growth work. Let's do a short break.
Did you know you can study with B and Uranio and work toward becoming a certified Chestnut Paes Enneagram professional? Join one of their workshops for professionals interested in integrating the Enneagram in skillful and effective ways to build your confidence applying the Enneagram as a tool to support your clients' growth and development. Learn how at www.cpenneagram.com.
Hello, it's me, Uranio. Just to tell you that B and I launched a new online workshop called the Enneagram Masterclass. It's a 6-hour video course that you can access at cpenneagram.com. You can go at your own pace and have lifetime access to it. Many beginner students have already watched it, but advanced students can also learn about the 9 types in a deeper way. We can't wait for you to check it out. Get $75 off your purchase by using code ChestnutPies75 on cpenneagram.com.
The Enneagram 2.0 podcast goes live every other Thursday on all main platforms. Stay tuned to learn more about yourself and others. Thanks for listening.
Some people think that people either are or aren't intuitive and from birth, but for me, it was not like that. It was something that opened up after doing some practices. Also, I learned over time how important it is not to mystify intuition or even this energy work like the projection of presence or resonance, because that is a capacity, but it can be done at times by people who are not doing the right psychological and spiritual work for some particular reasons that they end up finding it easy to do. But it can be done, therefore, by people who deal with it irresponsibly. And sometimes we see intuitive people who are not really a good example of being mature human beings from a psychological and spiritual perspective.
Yes, and I think intuition is not always well understood by people in general. But one of the things I've learned is that intuition needs to be developed. It often is something that comes as a kind of gift or strength that someone might have. However, it also needs to be worked with and developed. And as you're saying, it can get mixed up with ego. I think we either often dismiss people when we talk about intuition, like it doesn't exist, like some psychic phenomena that just people don't believe in. It either gets dismissed or sometimes people who are intuitive get glorified, I think, in ways that can be dangerous. Because this is what I've learned is it's a gift, it's a strength, just like anything else. It looks different in different people, but it needs to be actively developed. And as you're saying, it can get mixed up with ego, personality, like anything else. And so it's something that needs to be honed, not only as developing what it is, like if you have a capacity, like if someone's has a capacity to be a good athlete, for instance, they may just have some inborn gifts, but then they need to practice, right? If you want to become great at a sport, you need to practice that a lot to order to be good. Now, you get part of the way there because you may have some inborn strengths, but you need to develop it after that. But anyway, I see that you have worked on it and also, like you said, discovered some of these capacities that you have been able to develop in specific ways that I think really serve you well in being a practitioner that supports other people's inner work.
Yes, for all that. And it has always been important for me to have someone helping me see what I was not seeing when it comes to impact on people of this deeper way of working. on how ready people are to receive that, and to learn how to manage intuition and contain it so that it doesn't get overly crazy, or that it can be better integrated by people. And you particularly was an important presence in my life to help me regulate all that, and to teach me how to avoid further problems in the psychological realm, and how to identify some tricks that could be happening behind all that. I'm really grateful for all that. But I want to talk about also your intuition, and the particular ways that it shows up differently in you than it shows on me, but it's also strong. Can I do that?
Sure. And maybe like we did with you, it might be good to start a little bit with my background, which is more conventional, let's say, a little more mainstream. But I started off in academics, actually. I like a good two who can be confused about who she is. I didn't really know what I wanted to do with my life, like when I got out of college. And so I just kept going back to school, but I ended up, basically studying an academic discipline, mass media and politics, communication studies, that I think helped me in terms of grounding me in ways of knowing that were more intellectual, and developing knowledge and theory. And I feel like my thinking is often very grounded, and I look to the seminal authors. I like to build what I know on a solid foundation of learning from the most important people who've come before me. So I think that's what my academic life gave me. But after I got my graduate degree in communication studies, that's when I got even more into the Enneagram and got into my own psychotherapy. And through finishing my dissertation and going through a depression and really having to come to know more who I was from the inside, that led me to going back to school to become a psychotherapist. Because for the first time, I realized more who I was, to the point where I knew more what I really wanted to do, what I was really called to do, what I felt like I would be really good at and could really make an impact in the world. So I studied and became a psychotherapist.
And then later on, you started also having some very interesting manifestations of intuition, because you're already this great teacher and psychotherapist and author that had this special way to explain important concepts for people in a way that they took those in, but also with a lot of love and empathy. And later on, you developed this capacity to be in touch with people's hearts in a more integral way, meaning you would cry out the pain that people couldn't cry out on their behalf, or you would get in touch with some very unconscious source of pain of someone. And it's like going inside the person's heart and empathizing in a way that through your own heart opening, you help the person open their hearts.
Yes, and I have to say, I discovered that I don't know what to call it, that ability through seeing the work you were doing energetically with the Enneagram. And so I would never have described myself as intuitive. In fact, I think I always wanted to develop in that way. However, I think I had a lot of beliefs that just wasn't available to me, that I wasn't that kind of person. I thought of myself as someone who could, through applying a lot of effort in school or develop a kind of intellectual mastery of something, that felt more like something I could do through effort. But one of the things I've learned is when we get in touch with our deeper qualities and abilities, oftentimes it's more of a surrendering or an allowing than it is an efforting. And I think I've been engaged in a lot of efforting, and I've had to learn to undo that. But to get back to our story, I think, and I think this brings us to 2013, because I think this is when I began to realize the ability that you just described that I had no idea I had. And so, you and I knew each other in the 2000s, I guess from 2002 to 2009. First, we met at an Enneagram conference in Minneapolis, Minnesota in 2002. We were probably two of the younger people there at that time, and we met at an Enneagram conference of the International Enneagram Association. And then 2 years later, they asked us both to be on the board of directors of that organization at the same time. So you and I came on the board at the same time and served together for 6 years. I was president for 2 years. You were president for 2 years. And that's when we became good friends and colleagues. And I always appreciated being on the board with you at that time, because we always seemed to see things the same way, without much effort at all. We usually had the same viewpoint on what needed to happen or what we'd like to see happen. Sometimes you were more of a champion for certain things, and I was a champion for other things, but we were good allies on that board. And I think that was sort of our first place where we got to know each other and almost create a sense of mutual understanding about the importance of the Enneagram work.
Yes, exactly. And then later on, after being on the board, we met again at a conference. What year was that be?
That was 2013. And yeah, we had been a little bit out of touch. I think after we got off the board, we were both ready to be done with that for a while after 6 years, and weren't very much in touch for a few years. But then we reconnected in 2013, fortunately, at the International Enneagram Association conference in Denver. And a couple things were happening, I think, at that time. One thing is my book had just come out, The Complete Enneagram, the first book I wrote. And again, I never dreamed that I would actually write that book. I mean, it was many years in the making, but it was also a lot of conversations with my therapist about needing to own my power and my authority in order to think that I had something to say, because there were some good Enneagram books out there already. And who was I to think that I had something new or something to add to the literature? But because I really wanted to get the Naranjo version of the subtypes out there, and I really wanted to clarify the Enneagram in part for therapists, to provide a bridge to therapists from the Enneagram, but also to help people just understand the Enneagram in a deeper way from the point of view of someone who was a working psychotherapist. And I knew the Enneagram long before I went to school to study to become a therapist. And so wanting to bring the sort of psychological insights into the world for a wider audience to understand in a deeper way. And so that book came out right before that conference in 2013. And you and I reconnected. We had lunch, and that felt really good. And because of that, the next day, I remember it was a Saturday, I went to your session, and you were doing a session on, I did my session on Dante's Divine Comedy that year and my work integrating the Enneagram with it, but you did your session on energy work in the Enneagram. And it was funny because I remember so clearly thinking, what is Uranio doing with this energy thing? Because I had always known you as a business consultant, like you're a business guy, you're a coach, you're someone who knows the Enneagram at a very deep level, but uses it in the business context. So I wasn't really clear what this energy thing was that you were doing. I thought maybe it was related to business. I didn't know, but I was curious. And I remember making a really conscious decision. I really want to go to your session. So I went to your session, and there are only about, I'm going to say 25 or 30 people there. But, that one of the lessons of that day for me that has stuck with me ever since is that things happen the way they're meant to happen. And And I saw the energy work you were doing with the intuitive energy work you were doing with the Enneagram on the Enneagram mat. So you have this big, I don't know, 12 foot by 12 foot Enneagram, and you put it in the middle of the circle on the floor of this hotel meeting room, and you did an energetic exercise with us to create a kind of supportive field. And then you worked with individuals, moving them from their main point along the arrow lines to other points. And I was really blown away by what I saw happen in what you were facilitating there. And like, I remember one woman on point 7, she was a 7. This is the first person you worked with, and you moved her from 7 back against the arrow to 5. And it was exactly like we talk about now when we do this work with people. It was like going back in time. And it was like she went back to energetically embodying the pain of herself as a child when she wasn't held by her mother. And the way you facilitated that was incredible. And I remember coming to you later that night when I saw you at the conference party, saying, you did not tell me that you had transformed into this amazing energy healer. I mean, it was really incredible. And in that experience, I want to hear what you have to say about that moment. But in that experience, I had an experience with myself as part of that group, witnessing the work that you did with a few other people in this similar way, where I got in touch with the intuition of my heart in a way that was amazing to me.
Yeah, maybe we were meant to work together from that point, and we were both getting into the intuition we needed. Now, as you witnessed that day, that work is not for everybody. Some people can't stand the amount of energy that there is. Sometimes they even sleep. Other times they get frightened. But I'd say 75-80% of people get into the energy field and benefit a lot from that. Later on, I was still doing that kind of work at conferences. In a later year, I did an EndNote speech where I showed a little bit of that, doing some kind of deeper work. So many people loved it, and a few people didn't understand much of it. So eventually we started doing these workshops with the Enneagram mat, and you helped me so much to do them in the US. And we got closer, and we started creating this beautiful project we have today, this Chestnut Paes Enneagram Academy, where we concentrate most of the deep work that we do with energy and people on retreats. And then they get better contextualized for people who are on a path of development with us. So it's a school, not only, one of us offering workshops. But I think that allowing myself to explore that energy management technique helped me undertake the Enneagram with more depth. And when I say so, I include big time the dimension of essence for all 9 types. Like, I learned a lot how those virtues and holy ideas truly are when felt from the inside and when helping people reconnect to them, but many times healing psychological wounds first. And we got to learn how to heal wounds of different kinds, right? Abuses, traumas, some earlier experience in life that had not been integrated, and many more.
Again, I think some of this people may be listening to and finding a bit mysterious. So I want to try to clarify even more what you've just said. And I do want to start, I do want to continue to say a little bit about what happened when I first saw you doing this work, both at that 2013 conference, but also I got so interested in what you were doing, I started attending your workshops, right? I went to the UK and attended one. We met in South Africa where you had the opportunity to do some work. And so I started attending that and being part of what you were doing in that energy field work. And so I want to start from there to tell a little bit more of the story of how I think we came to work together and how we came to be very complementary in offering something I think really powerful that we can offer through the way that we've come to partner in this. And I just want to say at that 2013 experience, watching you do this work, I had two different experiences. One was with an 8-man, and you moved him first from 8 against the arrow to 2. And he went into a deeply emotional experience. I mean, went from being, this obviously powerful, strong guy at 8 to really getting in touch with his vulnerability around his mother in a deep way. And I remember just sobbing, like with him, like really in the energy of what he was feeling, and I just crying and crying. And I was stunned at myself that I was having this emotional reaction. And then you also worked with a 2, and you moved her from 2 against the arrow to 4. And she kind of came to her knees and got in touch with a deep pain. And I remember feeling that with her, both her story and my own story. It was almost like there was this resonance, like my story was similar to hers as a 2, and crying and crying. And I remember thinking to myself, well, everyone in the room must be crying like I am because this is just such a powerful experience. And I looked around and no one else was crying. And I think that was the first moment where I thought, wow, something interesting is happening here. And I think since then, it started by me attending more of these amazingly powerful workshops you were doing and understanding more about what you were doing, developing myself through you helping me do this work of getting more in touch with this deeper level of myself, maybe a more spiritual level as well. And then coming into some of my own abilities around, on the one hand, being able to, I think, teach and explain the Enneagram and experiences connected to it that have to do with the work to be done for each of the types and the subtypes, but also kind of bringing together the skills I developed training to be a psychotherapist of empathy, understanding someone deeply, entering into their world and seeing, okay, what's the core challenge here? What's the territory? What's going on with this person? What strengths aren't they developing? What wounds have they not healed? And so doing that from an intellectual point of view, but also a deeply emotional point of view. Like you said, I will often now start feeling something inside myself, almost start crying before the person cries, almost as a way to open up the space for them to enter into that. So I kind of want to name what we're doing for, what we're sort of coming at this from different angles. But now that, we started to realize that we could really be a powerful complementary combination because, you as a 5, having your, highly developmental point of view, but also this deep capacity for intuition and energy work and sensing, like you said, almost on an instinctual level, what's going on with someone, being able to project your presence and feel in your body what's going on in that person's body, me being able to feel more from an emotional heart level what's going on with that person at a deep level. We realized we could come together and offer opportunities to almost create a field, and we do this work in groups. So it's very much, and I was, by the way, trained in group facilitation in the early 2000s, right after I became a therapist. And that, for me, I think is a really vital part of what I bring here, because there's a deep understanding of the safety and support that needs to be created in a group, almost to create a safe container in which we can really create a field of energy that allows people to go beyond where they might be able to go with themselves. And sometimes even in a good therapy experience. Now, I think you and I are huge proponents of therapy, and we're always saying everyone needs to do therapy. And you've mentioned it as a way of integrating your experiences that you were having in other ways. For me, I was in therapy for 16 years. And for me, I think that was in part about getting to know myself as opposed to having my attention be out there in the world all the time on other people, the way it is as a two, but also as a way of learning about myself so much that I could, when I work with other people, and all along the way when I worked as a therapist with people, I can get myself out of the way. And I remember Helen Palmer talking about how she did this as an intuitive. Part of it is knowing her own personality and moving that a little bit out of the way and creating a space to experience what's going on with the other person. And I think each of us does that in different ways. And as you said, and we talk about this and we joke about this a lot, that I'm, as a self-preservation dominant person, I also tend to be a little bit more methodical, more about time management, more about grounding things in practical reality. And I think you're in touch with so much spiritually that there are all these different ways. You're the head, I'm the heart. You have this amazing ability to resonate physically, sensorially, energetically. I kind of resonate emotionally. And when we bring these pieces together, what we've ended up doing, and I think I told you recently, I never would have called what we were doing this at the beginning because I didn't know where we were heading. But I think what we do, and this is in our inner work retreats, is a lot of what we do is heal trauma through using the Enneagram as both a roadmap and also as a lens, as an entry point, as a way of understanding what's happening with the person, and heal some traumas that I think are universal, but also take a unique shape when they're experienced by a specific person with a specific type and subtype.
And I think you and I have always had, since the IEA board times, very similar views on what the Enneagram is about. Like forever, even in your early experiences as a psychotherapist, you have been doing very deep work with people, always concerned with healing, and not only just doing some more superficial work. And it's okay to do superficial work. It's just that it's not my thing. And I think that I saw that in you also, and you saw that in me. We wanted to do deeper approaches, and still we took the Enneagram theory in particular ways that made us be really close to each other in the understanding of what to do and how to do things. And you have always been so open to spirituality, not only psychology. And I've been very open to psychology and doing lots of psychological work myself. So I think we had enough common ground to start with. I mean, it was more than enough. And eventually we influenced each other in a way that we have almost total common ground today. And yet we are very different and complementary. I think that's one of the strengths behind what we do. And we like each other so much. And we try to leave that work, embody that work in our relationship, in our inner work. And I think one forces the other to keep working on ourselves. And also because we are these antidote types, B, of 2 and 5,
Yes.
we sort of naturally provoke each other to get out of the box.
Yes, I think that's really true. I think in all these different levels, we challenge each other to really walk the talk, to be on the path together, and, needing to, work out differences or conflicts that come up between us as close friends and business partners. We have both continued to support each other and challenge each other on the path of development that I think is an absolute requirement for anyone who is in the business of supporting other people in their development, especially when we're talking about psychological and spiritual development at a deep level in the way that I think we are both really, really driven to do. And one thing I also want to state is, again, we see the Enneagram, I think, in such a similar way as something derived from ancient wisdom. You know, I didn't study in a Gurdjieff school the way you did, but right after I learned about the Enneagram from David Daniels in 1990 as the typology, I had the good fortune when I went to graduate school, one of my cousins that lived right near me in Chicago, where I lived at the time, was really into the Gurdjieff work and gave me the book In Search of the Miraculous, which is such a beautiful entry point into understanding what Gurdjieff was all about and how he introduced the Enneagram as a symbol. Of course, it's written by one of his students, Ouspensky. And so I think we come from a very similar point of view, and I think we appreciate the work that each other has done, both in its complementarity and its similarity and its distinct differences.
Yeah, and you did so much more than you had time to mention. Work on Yogananda's way, and also all sorts of meditation, and you're always searching.
Yes, and I think that's another thing we have in common of like a good work ethic when it comes to the work is lifelong. It's something that's a continual evolution. So I think that's a big ingredient in what we bring to the work that we do with people around the Enneagram. And I think sort of as a way of moving toward wrapping up this discussion, I think really one of the main points we're heading toward in this conversation is highlighting the work we do with the Enneagram in terms of what we believe the Enneagram is best suited for doing and is really meant to do, which is really serve people in their pathway toward higher spiritual development, greater psychological development, and all the ways it informs what are the possibilities on that path. I think we've gone so much beyond what people sometimes think the Enneagram can do when we've applied it in these deep ways. And I've been really surprised at times about the way we can really get to the core of someone's issue rather quickly and really create a big shift for them. And again, this is not to glorify us. This is to really point to the ways we've been able to deploy the Enneagram with people who come to this work with a huge, powerful intention and a real commitment to themselves to really face the challenges they face and really open to and wanting a way of applying the Enneagram in the deepest and best way for their own healing and growth.
Yes, and you as a 2 and I as a 5, we both have arrows 2.8 on the Enneagram. And I think that helps us be, at the same time, do this work with people with a very big heart, like 8s have, especially evolved 8s, and yet be challenging in a way that we aim to really help people go beyond where they are. Mixing up an approach of gentleness with some challenges. I think we help each other on that, and we complement each other also when helping students.
Yes, I'm glad you mentioned that, because I think a really core value we have is the necessity for combining support, deep support, empathy, compassion for people, and confronting the ego, challenging people, especially if they're telling us, I'm ready for a growth shift. I'm ready. I'm tired of my personality, and I really want to move the needle to a higher place in my own development. And I think that, when someone comes to the work in that way, I think that we can really provide a big benefit by this combination of strength and the age kind of strength and commitment to facing the challenge, but also the mental perspective of you as a 5 and the heartfulness and empathy of me as a 2.
Yeah, and we still don't know where this is all leading us. We do our best to format our services and offer them, but it's always changing, always evolving. So very happy that there's a whole future for us to explore, B.
Yes, we just did an amazing retreat. For the first time, we did this particular retreat online, and it really worked. It was amazing. We had a beautiful group of people who did just incredible, awesome work. And yes, I think that's what's exciting about it is it's still unfolding. I think we're committed to seeing the Enneagram as something that has yet to be unveiled fully, that we're still decoding its mysteries and finding new ways to develop ourselves and help people develop themselves in light of all the incredible things we can do with the power through the power of the Enneagram. It's time for our top 5.
Top 5.
What is our top 5 today, B?
Our top 5 today is the top 5 most skeptical types. And I think we're thinking here about skeptical about the Enneagram. So what do you think of that?
Yeah, there are different things people are skeptical of. Sometimes it's spirituality, sometimes it's science, sometimes it's the Enneagram, sometimes it's anything else. So let's focus on skeptical about the Enneagram.
Yes, exactly. And I think it's probably skeptical about the Enneagram as a typology that might be applied to oneself. Is usually how it shows up. Yeah. Okay. So
yeah, and there are some other factors that might make people skeptical about the typological Enneagram that we're not covering here, and that people of any type could be skeptical. But yeah, in general, given our experience, right?
Yes, exactly. So what is your number 5 most skeptical person about the Enneagram?
Okay, so I first want to say that this was a hard top 5 for me to decide, because looking back to many years teaching the Enneagram to a lot of people, I had 7 candidates to make up to the top 5, but of course 2 of them didn't make it. I want to say which they were first. 9s and 3s. I want to say though that many times I saw people of those 2 types, especially in the self-preservation subtype of 9s and 3s, being skeptical. But they're not the most skeptical for me. And my number 5 is 7. Especially self-pres 7, but I've seen all subtypes of 7 being quite skeptical. But it's not the most skeptical. This is number 5 to me.
That's interesting. I also had a bit of difficult time narrowing it down to 5, so I cheated a little bit, and at number 5 I have a tie. So there's that. And I did something similar to what you just said. I mostly focused on types, not subtypes. However, I do have this type and especially this subtype of that type, just exactly like you just did. So for me, my number 5 is the one tie in my top 5, which is, it's a tie between 3 and 5. And this is because I think sometimes 3s are skeptical, partly because they may have a sense that it's going to get underneath their image, perhaps, and reveal more than they want to reveal. And sometimes they don't immediately see or agree with the goal of it. In other words, being more self-revealing, especially say in the workplace or something like that, that can feel a little bit like, what's the point or what's the goal that this is attached to? And if they're not behind the goal of self-development or sharing more of themselves with others, sometimes they can have a resistance, I think. I think with fives, I think it can go either way with fives. I was tempted to put them a little bit higher on my list, and I think there's an argument for that. But I think some fives really like the Enneagram right away. Other fives can be very skeptical and don't want anything to do with it. So I think because there's this mixed experience I've had with fives, I sort of split it down the middle and put them on my list, but on the lower end. Although I'm a little bit skeptical of my own placement of five, I have to say. I think they could be placed higher, but that's where I chose in the end to put them.
Yeah, I got your points though. The explanations are great. And my number five, when I say seven, I think I had in mind mostly self-pressed sevens, but sevens of all subtypes. Now my number four is sixes. And I think the main subtype of sixes that is more skeptical in my experience is sexual sixes. Sixes are skeptical about many different things. It's part of their personality. But when it comes to the Enneagram, I really don't see them as being the most skeptical, and they come a lot to workshops and read books. And I think that if it was something else, skeptical about something else, they would be higher on my list. But in terms of the Enneagram, they're number four because at least I see many sixes resisting, but not as much as the other three types that I'll have on number 1, 2, and 3 when I speak. What about you? What is your fourth?
My number 4 is type 8, and I think especially self-preservation 8. I don't see that many 8s coming to the work sometimes, and also I think there's a bit of a sense with 8s that somehow this might lead to them needing to be vulnerable. And without really thinking of that consciously, there's a bit of a resistance that comes up about considering the validity of this generally. It's a little bit like part of the 8's armor is to protect them against things like this that might imply they need to share more of what's deeper down or more vulnerable for them.
My third, I see many ones being skeptical a little bit because of that way of seeing things as black or white, and mainly social ones, I'd say, would tend to be skeptical, but all ones actually have that risk. I really base myself in my experience, and I think that the ones made number 3 because of the number of cases I saw with students being resistant. What is your third?
My third is also 1. And also for me, I had 1 and especially social 1. And I think this is because 1s tend to be very illogical and they can be a little bit rigid in their thinking about certain things. And I think sometimes the Enneagram either doesn't make sense to them, or there's something about it that doesn't feel right, or they just have a sense of non-adaptability, as we call social ones, around being open to this kind of a thing if it doesn't make immediate logical sense to them.
Do you want to say your second, or should I say?
Similar to one of the earlier ones, I think your number 5, I have 7 as my second, and especially self-preservation also, like you said. I find self-preservation 7s to be quite skeptical generally of things. And I think especially with the Enneagram, it can be a little bit, there's almost like a little bit of suspicion self-preservation sevens can have. And I think it's also connected potentially to their desire to have freedom and not be limited in any way. So don't put me in a box, don't tell me how to think about myself. And also a little bit of fearfulness. And I think self-preservation sevens usually are more consciously fearful than the other two sevens. And so it can be a little bit like, what is this going to say about me? How might it limit me or put me in a box? How might it ask me to reveal something about myself I don't want to reveal? So this results in a kind of skepticism, I think, with this seven. So what about you? What's your number 2?
My second is my type, 5s. I think I've seen so many 5s being skeptical. I've been challenged at workshops by so many 5s. In my case, I spent many years teaching in organizations, and many times the participants at a workshop had not decided themselves to be there. And I think that gives me a good look into who's skeptical when coming to a workshop without having chosen to do so, right? So I experienced so many 5s pushing back, at workshops at least. And 5s can be a lot skeptical. I think self-preservation 5s are the most skeptical, but social 5s can also be quite skeptical depending on what their totem is. Like we'd say social 5s are the totem, right? It's like there is an area of knowledge and a field of cultural identity that I try to be in and be important in there. If that area is science or some area that includes skepticism, they will be skeptical. Like even me, I'm a big time Enneagram supporter, but I just know that if I had studied psychology in Brazil, I would be radical in terms of psychoanalysis at my early 20s, like when I was 18, 19, I would become a radical, and maybe I wouldn't have been this open to something like the Enneagram. I think there is this risk for 5s.
I agree with everything you're saying, and it makes a lot of sense. And I would even, I think, if I had to do this over again, put 5 higher up on my list. I think you've really convinced me.
But since our number 1 is very different from each other, although we may have mentioned the same types among the 5, what is your number 1?
Yes, my number 1 is 6. And I have experienced a lot of skepticism in 6s about the Enneagram. But I have to say, in hearing what you said, it made me realize I think I've been thinking a little bit about my experience more in the business setting with this. I think you're right. Generally, we do get a lot of 6s coming to deep inner work workshops, and there are a lot of 6s who I think are very broad-minded and appreciate the complexity and the systematic quality of the Enneagram. And so I think when I was thinking about this, I was really impacted more by my experience in the business setting, because I've experienced a lot of 6s in the workplace being very skeptical of this. Usually they're the one person on a team, for instance, that doesn't readily see the value of the Enneagram, that kind of keeps their guard up, that maybe doesn't want to be typed, and asks a lot of questions. And it's almost not until we do more of the teamwork and they start seeing the positive things happening for other people that they open up more. But sometimes there's resistance to being typed, or they hide out in another type. And so I think that impacted me a lot when I was putting 6 at number 1, a kind of skepticism, especially in environments where they are wary of being vulnerable or letting their guard down or opening up to sharing more information about themselves with other people. I think I was thinking in those terms more than I realized at first, but that's what I would say in terms of why I put 6 at number 1. What do you think?
It makes sense to me. Yeah, I agree with you actually. Now, one question I have for you. When I mentioned 6s as my number 4, I said that in my experience, sexual 6s are the most skeptical in average. Would you agree with that, or do you have another experience?
I would say yes. I was thinking of all 3 6s potentially being skeptical in different ways. I think with self-preservation 6, it's more about doubt, how they kind of think of all the reasons why they might have to question things and doubt something and not necessarily want to let it in out of an excess of fearfulness about what is this thing and what will it do. And I think social 6s, it's a little bit like what you said with social 5s. If it's not part of their way of thinking, the kind of systems that they refer to as authorities in what they see as valid or invalid in the world, I think they can be skeptical. On the other hand, like if you find a social 6, for instance, who's really open to spirituality and things like psychological systems of understanding people, then I think you might get a social 6 that's really open to it. So it's a little bit like what you said about social 5. It depends on the mindset and what they're already thinking of as in terms of the authority in their life around what they think and what they believe in. So I think it could go either way with self-preservation and social 6, but I can see them being skeptical. But I also agree with you that the sexual 6 might be the most skeptical because it's almost like there's a knee-jerk first line. What is this? It's a little bit of aggressiveness and pushing it away at first around being more suspicious or contrarian that I think can come up for the sexual 6. So I do agree with you, but I can also see how the other 6s can be skeptical.
Interesting that for both you and I, all 3 mental types were part of our top 5s. 5, 6s, and 7s, meaning that, as we know, mental types tend to be a bit more skeptical. Now, my number 1 is 8s, and mainly self-pres 8s. I just think that many 8s are very concrete, and when it comes to, going more abstract and talking about motivations and motives behind behavior, sometimes it's not as easy for 8s and they get resistant. Some 8s just don't want to open up for something like the Enneagram. But again, a little bit like you said for 5s, but a little bit like you said for 5s, I think that 8s either are very skeptical and resistant or really enthusiastic. It's a little bit about the excess and lust for 8s, but I think that it's hard to see too many 8s in public workshops, introductory workshops. They aren't the type that goes for it the most. So 8s are my first. But you also influence me with your opinions. I'll rethink all my concepts also.
Yes, and I did have 8, and especially self-preservation 8 as my number 4. And I also think in the business setting especially, I've run into a lot of 8s that are very skeptical of this. And so I agree with you in much of what you said. Thank you for listening. Join us again for our Enneagram 2.0 podcast, where we talk about all things Enneagram.
Yeah, Enneagram 2.0, find your personality. Chestnut Paes, Enneagram Academy. What's your type? What's your subtype? So much you can learn. You can be amazing. Go ahead and transform. It's for yourself and others. Grow and follow the flow. And also for the planet, yeah, let your mind blow. It's from B and Uranio. Time for you to know and be your best self with Enneagram 2.0. Psychology, self-mastery, work in relationships, spirituality. Come and join the podcast. Oh yeah, it will be fun. Explore the challenges that from now you'll overcome. Hey, Enneagram 2.0. Tune in, yeah, it's your personality. Enneagram 2.0. Chestnut Paes, Enneagram Academy. Hey, Enneagram 2.0. Tune in now.